Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 33rd episode of Let's Do Lunch. It's Wednesday, so we'll be discussing the business of games. As a reminder, we chat open, so please introduce yourselves and others. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a separate button down below on the bottom nav. And again, for the chat, make sure to change your drop down from just panelists to panelists and attendees, so that we can all see your comments. We have a terrific show today. We have Anya Combs on the show. Anya is the director of games at Kickstarter, the crowdfunding platform that is really popular among creatives. And I'd like to invite her to join the show. Come on.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. How are things in New York?
New York's a little wild right now. I'm very lucky because I live in one of the outer boroughs. So I live in Queens. That would be like living in Oakland to San Francisco, I guess you could say. So it's not as chaotic out here, but it's a little weird to not hear car horns constantly honking like you usually do in New York.
I'm sure. Yeah, it seems like everyone's having a similar but differing just experiences all around all the world. I mean, we're all this together. Hey, listen, I wanted to start with how you came to Kickstarter and what attracted you to the company.
Yeah, so my background's actually in music. I studied music in college. I thought I would be a professional saxophone player.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Do you still play sax? Yeah.
I do. Yeah. I mean, obviously everything's on hiatus right now, but pre-COVID, I played in 5 bands here in New York, so it's a lot, but it's fun.
Cool. Yeah.
So I got my start in games in 2008. So I've been in games almost 12 years. I started at a little flash game website called addictinggames.com, where I helped find the games for the site. We were owned by Viacom, and so we were under actually the Nickelodeon brand at Viacom. And I worked in San Francisco for a really long time. That's where I'm from the Bay Area. And they decided to shut our San Francisco office down, and they gave a couple of us opportunities to move out to New York and work at Nickelodeon headquarters. And I was like, I've always wanted to live in New York. That sounds awesome. So I moved out to New York and started working at Nickelodeon HQ, where I did content development and a lot of like mobile production and just tons of stuff at Nickelodeon. And I was at HQ like 2.5 years and was like, wow, this corporate thing is not for me. As you can see with my piercings and my tattoos, not a great fit for a weirdo like me. And so I was just sort of like looking for new opportunities and new things, and was actually thinking like, I don't even know if I want to stay in games. I love the industry, but the games industry in New York is very different than the games industry in the Bay. And so I started applying for just a ton of jobs, and this games outreach lead position sort of just appeared one day, and I was like, oh, cool, that sounds amazing. And I had one of my coworkers, her husband worked at Kickstarter, and I was like, we heard a lot of good things about the company. So I applied, and they, for some crazy reason, immediately liked me. And so I got the position at Kickstarter, which was really cool. And it's been a pretty wild, like 4.5 years at Kickstarter, I have to say.
Well, and it's interesting because, I for the longest time, I guess I kind of thought of Kickstarter as really kind of built more around the music industry. How long was games in the mix from the very beginning, and has it always been kind of part of the creative focus of the company?
Yeah, so games has definitely always been there, but it kind of really took off when Tim Schafer and Double Fine launched their video game.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and
which was a huge campaign, right?
Huge, yeah. It was like over $1 million. There was I wasn't at the company then, but there was a huge party in the office when Kickstarter's based in Brooklyn. Kickstarter used to be based in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, so In the days of the Lower East Side, there was a big party in the office. There's still like photos somewhere. So my direct boss, Luke Crane, who is the founder and owner of Burning Wheel, which is a very popular RPG base company.
Role-playing games for anybody who doesn't know the
sorry.
RPG. Yeah.
This is the harsh secret in games, is that we use a lot of lingo that we just assume everybody knows. So like, feel free to call me out if you're like, I have no idea what that term means.
We'll do it.
I apologize for that. So Tim Schafer and Double Fine really kind of like helped put Kickstarter on the map in terms of crowdfunding for games. And then once Luke was brought in to really kind of like take over the games community, obviously he has a strong, deep knowledge and pedigree in the tabletop space. And so he really brought the tabletop community to Kickstarter. And so now games is roughly a third of all the revenue that's generated on Kickstarter. So it's a pretty significant amount. Yeah. Well, last year we, April of 2019, we had $1 billion pledged to just games alone. And it looks like this year we'll probably have about $1 billion pledged to just tabletop games.
Wow, I didn't realize it was so big. And I read somewhere that you've had over 7,000 game projects on the platform. 3.6 million people have backed game projects over the years. Really a amazing feat. And you know what I think interesting in chatting with you about this yesterday is I would have thought that it was mostly video games, but that's not the case. And so talk a little bit about like what kind of games are getting funded, and you mentioned tabletop. What is a tabletop game,
Yeah, so tabletop games, I'd say it's probably like a 70-30, 60-40 split, but the tabletop space is definitely more prevalent. So tabletop games for us encompasses a whole bunch of different types of games. So tabletop for us includes card games, any sort of like gear that's associated with any RPG. So if that's like dice, if that's miniatures, even like bags that hold dice, like anything that's sort of in that like paraphernalia that sort of encompasses RPGs, RPGs essentially. That also does include just like traditional board games, right? Like a board game that you just lay out and it's got pieces. So if it's like a Candyland or something like that, that's all encompassing of board games. So it kind of runs the gamut. But basically, if you were to go into any like board game store or cafe, those games are most likely, unless it's a big Hasbro game, they were probably funded on Kickstarter.
Wow. So one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about is, how have, it's been about 8 weeks since we've had the stay-at-home orders. How has that changed things in terms of, the funding side? New projects coming on the platform, with tabletop games, I imagine there's production and shipping needs that have to be taken into consideration. How are people dealing with these issues today?
Yeah, I mean, from a business side, Kickstarter, definitely we've seen like pledges have been down. That's across the whole platform though, right? And so I think one of the things to keep in mind is games is one of 14 categories on Kickstarter, right? And so while games is such a huge, healthy, part of the ecosystem, there are other categories, right? There's music, there's design and technology, there's fashion, there's food, dance, theater, things like that. And so unfortunately, a significant number of the pledges, the reasons the pledges have been down is because some of the more sort of cultural categories, so specifically I'm thinking like theater, dance, arts, it's difficult to launch a project that sort of requires people to be in a confined space together, right? So if that's a dance project, how do you fund a dance project when you can't, as a dancer, even like potentially meet with your team, right? So that's one of the challenges that we're seeing. So pledges are down about 30%, which really sucks for a lot of reasons. We've unfortunately had to let some of our staff go. So last week we went through layoffs, which I think a lot of companies are going through. So it's been a bit of a trauma situation for us.
I'm sure.
But the other side of it, that's like, it's hard to be celebratory because of, obviously what's going on, and it feels a little disingenuous to do that, but games is still doing extremely well. It's obviously impacted us too. We typically see around this time of year 500 to 600 live projects at any given point in the games category, and we're down to about 470 to about 500, which is not huge. It's not a huge loss by any means, but it's definitely down. And we've seen a little bit of a dip in our pledges. However, the other side of that is 2 weeks ago, we just had the Frosthaven, which is from Isaac and his team. And they now have the most funded games project of all time. And they brought in $12.9 million to the platform, which is
Is that Javon Fraser? Or Studio 71? Or?
Oh, no. Totally different team, totally independent of Javon. But yeah, it's still kind of crazy. Like, there's still multiple $1 million projects in the tabletop category. We also had 3 over $1 million projects in video games, which included the Sabotage Studio team who made The Messenger, which was really popular a couple of years ago, and their prequel, Sea of Stars, which funded a couple, I guess maybe a month or 2 ago at this point. They made over $1 million, which is, it's just a wild time.
Are you having any issues with fulfilling some of your projects that have been funded, not being able to fulfill kind of benefits that were promised, and is that an issue for folks?
I think that's one of the criticisms that we hear a lot about Kickstarter. And I think there's kind of 2 things that I would say. One, the number of projects who are just unable to fulfill, it's actually a lot lower than people think. But I think because those ended up making more of a press sort of there's more press around the projects that don't fulfill versus the ones that do fulfill, right? Because the other side of this is when games are successful, especially in video games, Kickstarter doesn't really get any credit, which is fine. That's totally okay with us. We don't necessarily need it. But it is interesting to kind of see these video games didn't fulfill, but there's no mention of the ones that actually did. So it's not as prevalent as I think people think. What's more common than anything else is development delays. But that's not that's pretty common just in video game development. It's a little less prevalent in tabletop games. The other side of this is obviously people have, kind of taken into consideration, if we're going to launch a game that requires some sort of physical game, obviously that's what a tabletop game is. We kind of need to think about our manufacturing and our shipping and all of that. How are we going to actually ship something safely, and how are we going to manufacture something safely within, sort of confines of COVID? And a lot of people are sort of moving their operations from overseas to the US. There's a lot of people that are just kind of doing stuff at home, right? If it's 3D printing, the models for minis, right? Basically it's a plastic mold and then you just sort of churn them out. A lot of those that are typically done in China, they're moving them back over to the US. But I would also say, obviously we've seen China's starting to kind of things are starting to open a little bit more. And I think a lot of people are sort of anticipating that, in the next couple of months when they're in their fulfillment space, hopefully things are going to be a little bit more open. So there's a little bit of uncertainty, but everybody's sort of thinking about, what are distribution opportunities?
Right. I want to spend a little time kind of breaking down, what makes sense for Kickstarter, kind of what differentiates you guys. So, and maybe some of the best practices for putting a campaign onto Kickstarter. But let's start with, there are a lot of crowdfunding platforms out there. How are you different than, say, I don't know, Indiegogo, Patreon, and any of the others that are out there that are focused on the creator community?
Yeah, so I think the most simplistic answer, and this sounds a little braggy, but we are the biggest. We also see, interestingly enough, that when people say that they have, nobody really says, oh, I crowdfunded this. They say I Kickstarted this, whether they used Kickstarter or not, which is always like a really interesting thing to me.
You're like the Xerox of the crowdfunding.
Exactly, yeah. We like to say that we're sort of the Band-Aid of the crowdfunding.
Band-Aid, right? Yeah.
So it is sort of interesting, right? Like we have the biggest community, we have, you know, the most repeat backers. It's just sort of, that's just the reality. But the other side of that is like what separates us from other crowdfunding spaces. So one, we do not have, nobody at Kickstarter has the stance that like Kickstarter is for everyone, right? Like the whole thing about crowdfunding is that the reason there's different models is because there's different opportunities for what it is that you're looking for. So Patreon, as an example, is a subscription-based model, right? So for like $5 a month, you constantly get something. If that's music, maybe it's a song, maybe it's a lesson. For $20, you get, you know, more content that you're sort of looking for. I know it's really prevalent in the podcast community, which makes a lot of sense, like additional podcasts and things like that. Kickstarter is not a subscription model. It's an all or nothing model. Indiegogo has the opportunity to do all or nothing or flexible funding. So flexible funding is if your goal is 50,000, but you only raise 20,000, you keep the 20,000 no matter what. And the reason we don't do flexible funding is it's not that it's a bad model by any means. We've just seen that like there's sort of repercussions that come with it. So I'm thinking specifically again with sort of my games hat on, if you know you need $50,000 to make your game, but you only bring in 20, but you promise to make something with the $50,000 goal, and you need to figure out how to make that additional $30,000, you still have to come out with what you kind of promised you were going to make. So we just kind of think that the all or nothing funding model is sort of a protection for the creator and the backer over anything else.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I mean, and there's some different models. Will be one of our poll questions for folks. You know, in terms of how backers, you know, support projects. There's no equity when somebody supports a project on Kickstarter.
Correct. No equity. Yeah. So
yeah.
Oh, so yeah. So the reason we don't do equity, so we really believe in creative freedom and independence. We think that you as a creator, you know what's best for your project. Obviously with games, there's you know, and to a certain degree, other categories to music, maybe you sign with a label, you know, with film, maybe you have a production company or something like that, or distribution company that maybe you didn't have before. But for games, there's always an opportunity to potentially work with a publisher. And I think that the conversation around publishers is sort of, it's constantly shifting in games. I think right now, like publishers we're a little more yay publisher than we were maybe like 5 years ago. But it's interesting because what I've seen a lot of people do is they use their Kickstarter project as essentially like, they're sort of able to say like, well, I have all these people that are willing to back me. So you publisher, how do I make sure that I have the publishing deal that I want, that's good for me, versus I need a publisher, I'll do whatever I need to like, you know, make sure that I get this publishing deal go through. But we found with equity that you, and again, there are crowdfunding sites that have the equity opportunity. And if that's what you want to do, that's great. Like you should do it. You should do what is best for you and your team. But we found that it kind of takes away from sort of the spirit of the independent, you know, spirit that we really try to all encompass.
So what are some of the benefits that a funder would get typically in a game, you know, game project funding scenario?
For a backer, like what they would get? Yeah. So I mean, the baseline is the game, right? So you get the game, you get the video game, you get the card game, you get the board game, whatever it is. For board games, it can be like, you know, multiple copies of a game, something like that. You can get like, if it's a well-known team or something, you could get like a signature, you know, there's tons of opportunities. The biggest thing that we see that I think is so interesting is more of the sort of customizable side of things. So, for example, having your name in like a liner book and like in the credits of like a board game or a card game. And the same thing happens in video games. If for like, you know, X amount of money, you become an executive producer on the game or something like that. I think the most famous one is Mighty No. 9, which has a whole sort of like controversy around it, but they had 4 hours of credits at the end of the game. So people were like scrolling through the credits to like take you know, photos of the game, stuff like that. There's also like what I've seen in video games, what a lot of people do is for like a high reward amount. So like $3,000-$4,000, you pledge $3,000-$4,000, you're able to like really work with the creator on certain aspects of the game. So if that's like designing a villain, designing another character, something like that, like being able to kind of have your touch on the game is like, I mean, that's such a like special opportunity.
Yeah, that's a special opportunity. Yeah. Hey, what is the average pledge on Kickstarter, kind of across the all the projects?
Yeah, so average for all projects, I'm not sure. I'm definitely happy to look that up, but I would say for video games, it's about 20 to 25, and for board games, it's more about 50, which kind of makes sense, right? Like for a big board game with lots of miniatures that you would like buy in a store, it's probably about $50. And a game on Steam, $15-$20.
So in a way, it's kind of a pre-sale process.
I mean, we don't like to think of it in those terms, but yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. All right, let's take a couple of questions because we're starting to get a bunch of them, and I kind of fall behind here. So, Anne Marie hi Anne Marie or Maria. 3 successful Kickstarter projects. Yay, great. Do you have suggestions on how to communicate and keep in touch with your backers after you have given the awards and shipped the game?
Yeah, so you always have the opportunity to continue to post updates. I would also encourage you to see if you're like, give your backers the opportunity to sign up for a mailing list that you have. So just to take a little bit of a step back here. So the way that Kickstarter works is when a backer backs your project, you don't get any information, personal information about the backer. You can see like their Kickstarter profile, you can communicate with them through the messaging system on Kickstarter, but like emails and things like that, you don't get access to any of that, right? It's a privacy concern. So when your project is done and it's funded, and this is only if the project funds, if the project doesn't fund, you don't send out any surveys or anything like that, because you don't have anything to send. But if your project funds,
and people's money goes back to them, right? If it doesn't.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, no exchange of money or anything like that. Again, all or nothing crowdfunding platform. Yeah. So your project is funded and you're ready to fulfill your project. You send a survey once you're sort of ready to go through that fulfillment process. And depending on the rewards and how you've structured that, that's the information that you would put into your survey that you send out to your backers. But typically that's like, you know, an email address to ship like a Steam code. Or if it's, you know, a board game, you'll ask for a mailing address. You can ask people if they want to be included in your mailing list in those surveys. But if you've already sent your surveys and you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to do that, you can post an update and say, hey, we'd love for you to sign up for our mailing list.
Okay, let's go to let's see, Chris Ramanathan. Hopefully I pronounced your name right, Chris. Our game is done, but we have zero budget for marketing, PR, raising awareness. What would you recommend using? Would you recommend using Kickstarter for this purpose?
Well, if your game is done and you're using Kickstarter for a marketing opportunity,
for marketing, it sounds like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's definitely not impossible. I think there's a couple things here, though. So I would be very cautious in sort of saying on your Kickstarter page, like, we're just using this to get, a community. Instead, this is sort of a weird cheeky secret, and it's coded language. But if you were to say, we have our Kickstarter project, we want $20,000 because we have the last 10% of development, right? And development is sort of a nebulous term. It can mean a lot of different things. And it's an argument to be made that development does include some of the marketing, right? It's, there's an opportunity there. But I would say the thing to keep in mind is if you come to Kickstarter without a community, it's not going to really yield a lot of results in terms of building that community. So what we see on the back end of Kickstarter for game projects is roughly a 30-70 split. So 30% of your pledges are going to come in through Kickstarter, And I would note that does also include any sort of promotions that Kickstarter is able to provide. So there's a misconception that if you like are on the front page of Kickstarter and you're featured and you're in newsletters and things like that, that there's just this like influx of pledges that come in. Sometimes it depends on the project, but I would say more often than not, like it's just not, it doesn't really happen. So that means that you as the creator are essentially responsible to bring in like 65 to 70% of your pledges. And so I get a lot of questions of like, well, we don't even have any money to do that. Like, how do we build a community? And the easiest answer is like, you have to get on the internet. So the entire games industry is on Twitter. That's how we all communicate with each other. So jump on Twitter, start following people that you find to be like influential or interesting within the games community, and engage with them. Like get to kind of know these people. At the end of the day, like we're all humans and we all are just kind of looking to like connect with each other. And people like to hear that you like their work. Like it's a good feeling. If you don't have a Discord for your studio or for your game, create a Discord, join a bunch of Discords. Obviously with COVID and not being able to be in, confined spaces with each other, conferences are basically not happening. But if you have the opportunity to like go to, any sort of like online virtual conference, that's great. You should do that. If there's any sort of like local groups, right? So if it's like a local Facebook group if you're in like, I'm just going to say Cincinnati, Ohio, because it's the first thing that came to my mind. I don't know why. But if you're in Cincinnati and there's like, Gamers for Cincinnati or something like that, like join everything that you possibly can and be a part of that. And then just start building your community from there.
Any questions or thoughts on like what kind of size of community people need to have before they can be effectively utilize Kickstarter?
So the simple answer is as big as possible. But to kind of give you some metrics, so think about terms of $50,000. So you need $50,000 to make your game. So take 50,000 and divide that by 20, and I think that's 2,500. 20 because again, that's typically what you're going to ask for in terms of like what the actual game is going to be. So, but let's say that it's 10, let's say it's 30, whatever it is. So take your funding goal and divide it by what sort of that base reward tier is going to be. That's going to tell you basically how many people need to come to the page to fund your project. I always encourage people like, in a lot of ways, Kickstarter is very much a numbers game. So try to double how much of a community it is you need to bring in. So if it's 25, bring in 50.
Yeah, great. We've had a few people ask questions about essentially the percentage of game projects that ship versus don't ship, or I guess don't hit their goal versus hit their goal. Is that data that you might?
Yeah, so I can tell you that the overall success rate on Kickstarter is about 40%. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to get these numbers right. I'm actually going to pull up something really quickly, which is a presentation I'm doing tomorrow all about.
Right.
But I can give you those exact numbers if you give me just a second here. But yeah, so the success rate on Kickstarter for games as a whole is 40%. And for video games, it's 21.8%. However, in 2019, I believe that was 26, and so far in 2020, it's 24%. And tabletop games is a 60% success rate, but
wow.
Yeah, I think in 2019 it was 68, and in 2020 it's 70.
Okay.
So it's a lot, but also just to kind of add to that.
Yeah.
In terms of the projects that fund and come out, right, actually fulfill, it's 89 to 90%.
Terrific. Let's see. Jason Hines asked, what are the highest converting incentives for games that hit goal? And then he gave a few examples: stickers, early game access, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things that you see working?
Yeah, so for video games, we actually don't recommend, unless you have you're able to really think about the costs. But for video games, we sort of encourage people to stick with digital rewards, right? So if you do things like stickers and t-shirts and buttons and physical rewards, there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind. One is manufacturing, cost of manufacturing, and two, the biggest one is cost of shipping. So let's say that you're a US based developer, but for whatever reason, like your game just takes off in Australia and you have like 200 orders of physical rewards that you have to ship to Australia. It's a lot of money that's going to eat into your costs. So we try to recommend just sticking with digital rewards. But things that people really like, again, I mean, the biggest thing is the game. That's the biggest thing that people just want more than anything else. But the sort of secondary thing, again, is like customized content. So being part of the project with you, right? So like having your name in the credits, having a backer's name in the credits. If you can, you know, at a higher amount, having, you know, executive producer credits and things like that. The other option too, depending on, you know, there's a couple things here. So one, another really popular thing is having your, like, a backer's face in the game, right? So like maybe modeling a character after a backer. But the thing is, like, you have to keep in mind that that does require labor. So we sort of recommend that if you want to do that, like, talk to your artist, talk to your programmer, and see how many they can actually do. So if they're saying 10 is the limit, you have the opportunity to do that on Kickstarter. You can say, like, it's 10 of 10 and that's it. And that's, you know, this is just sort of a limited tier reward for like a high amount. The other thing is like personal Skype calls or Discord calls and things like that, like being able to have that face-to-face interaction. People love stuff like that, and keep it to like half an hour, right? Like, time is money, money is power. So
what any stats on did you guys kind of know who's back, who the supporters are for these games, and you know, is it millennials, or you know, like who are supporting projects on Kickstarter?
So I'm actually really proud to say that Kickstarter is one of the few tech companies that doesn't collect data. So we don't really know. I mean, there's some sort of like anecdotal stuff that we can say, right? So you have to be 18 to use Kickstarter. So suspect it's mostly like 25 to like 45-year-olds roughly, especially in games. But in terms of like skewing male to female, we have no idea. I couldn't tell you, which is kind of cool. However, there is a little bit of information in the community tab on every project, so you can see just like country-wise where people are coming from. But that's really about it.
I'm seeing some questions that, you know, this is typically our video game day, so we have a lot of people from you know, that side of the industry. Russell Binder, hey Russell. Russell's been working in licensing of games for a long time, and he has an interesting. Do you see a different type of engagement from investors or funders, I guess, between original and licensed games? Are you getting many licensed games on the platform?
We actually get more licensed games for tabletop. Marvel, I think it was, oh gosh, I know it was Marvel. I don't remember exactly what property, but actually Resident Evil 3 just funded today. But I would say that like there's a lot more in the tabletop space versus the video game space. There's a couple in video games, but mostly it's original IP.
Cool. All right, Laura, let's put up the poll for everybody. I think we have 5 questions. Can everybody see the poll? Okay, and we'll give 5-10 minutes here for folks to answer the question. We'll circle back to the poll questions. Okay, Joe Jason asked the following question. Anya, my question is simple. In the past 2 years, what percentage of the entire Kickstarter entity campaigns have been physical products versus digital products? Fact or speculation is answer is fine. Joe Jason.
I think I actually don't understand the question. It may not be as simple as you think.
Yeah, Joe, do you want to clarify your question, and we'll circle back to that. If you want to write a clarification, we'll come back, because I'm not really understanding it either. Which have been physical products, digital products? Maybe that is the question, though. Is it, you know, physical versus digital products that are on the platform? You know.
Well, I think if I understand correctly, right. So some of these terms are so like all-encompassing. So I'm thinking at it from the perspective of, by digital, do you mean just video games? And by physical, do you mean tabletop? Or are you asking, in the video game space, knowing that this is more of a video game-based webinar, how many creators that have tried to fund a video game are using physical rewards and are more successful? That's the question that
I think it was the former, which I think you may have answered previously, 70-30 split between.
Yeah. So I could kind of answer it a couple different ways. So tabletop games are much more common, obviously, and they fund a little bit more, and it makes sense if you think about it from like, you know, the marriage between like tabletop games and Kickstarter. I need X amount of money to make my board game. I come to Kickstarter and find it, right? Like it's a perfect marriage. Video games, it's a little more difficult. There's a lot of development and licensing, and you know, technology is constantly being updated and improved, and so there's just a little bit more to it. And that's not just Kickstarter, that's the video games industry as a whole. But in terms of like video games that have tried to kind of bring in people with physical rewards, I don't know the percentage of that, unfortunately. I would have to do a little bit of digging on that. That's a little more difficult for us to kind of like determine, but I would say it's more common for people to just rely on digital rewards for video games.
Got it. Okay. Well, if he posts something else, we can circle back. So I'm curious, like, what are some of the weird, quirky projects that you've seen on the platform? Can you give us, you know, a couple of examples?
Yeah. There was a project, this is actually before my time, but we used to just kind of like have little retrospectives at Kickstarter years and years and years ago. But someone tried to fund a time travel machine, which was like literally just a cardboard box. But the way that the project was sort of presented, we couldn't tell if he was kidding or if he was serious. And so it was a wild ride. It was definitely one of the funnier projects that I've ever seen. For video games, there's a video game that was funded a couple years ago called Hypnospace Outlaw, which is just like an exploration of like old technology. It's kind of a wild game to watch. There's also a really heartbreaking game, but it's really sweet, called That Dragon Cancer, which was a father sort of coming to terms with his child passing away, but he used his kid's actual voice in the game before his son died of brain cancer.
Wow.
It was like a very, very powerful game, I have to say. And then for me personally, like one of my pride and joys of working at Kickstarter was the Trogdor board game. That was just a delight to kind of see come to life, this like property that, you know, obviously the Chapman brothers own, being able to see that come to life and having like if you told 18-year-old me that I would like get to know the brothers Chaps as people and be able to just text them at any point, I'd probably call you crazy and walk away. But they ran an incredible campaign. So it was just so wild to see like my internet life suddenly become an actual board game that I can touch.
So do you have much communication with the creators who are on the platform?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't talk to every creator. It's unfortunately just not possible. But you know, my team is really small. It's me. I have someone starting next week, thank God. And I have a contractor in Germany, and that is it. That is the games team. We're very, very small. So I try to talk to as many people as I can. And, you know, everybody's always like, I encourage everyone to email me. That's totally fine. I'm on basically every social media platform that you can possibly think of, and my name's not that common, so I'm pretty easy to find. But I'm always happy to talk to people and answer any questions.
Terrific. If you guys see, I mean, are there any situations where there's just kind of a red flag? You see a project come up and you think it might be a scam. And what do you guys do in that situation? Do you pull projects ever?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we get this question a lot, especially when it comes to copyrights, especially if it's like clearly someone they do not have the right or the license to make this project.
Sure.
And it's kind of a challenging situation for us because at the end of the day, like, it's kind of not our responsibility to kind of police for those types of things, right? I am not a lawyer, but from what I understand, the law kind of like we have some sort of legal language that says like it's not even, we can't even say like you don't have the copyright to this, like you don't have the right to do this. We don't It's not there's nothing we can do about that. But I would say that it is up to the community, and the community will let us know, like, hey, they stole this game. And even something like, those are more of the egregious cases. But if it's like, this was stolen from a friend of mine, there's a DMCA claim that anybody can kind of write in and say, like, this is stolen property at any given point. Like, that's absolutely your right. The other side of that too is, especially with design and technology projects, renderings they're really, really challenging. And we have pretty strict guidelines on what types of like new tech, new toys, new kind of like gadgets and things like that. You have to really show that something is functioning. So if you have like a 3D rendering, if you have like a prototype that's just like a video, it's not going to fly. We need to see that this is something that is actually, you can actually make.
Joseph Welton actually kind of had a question that I think you kind of answered, but I'll state it here. He said, I'm somewhat familiar with licensing agreements, but could you shed light on how licensing works for something needing crowdfunding? What kind of agreements are required ahead of time between licensor and the speculative licensee? I mean, it sounds like what you said is that you guys are covered by DMCA. You're just a platform. You really don't get involved with those licensor arrangements. Is that right? Or
correct? Yeah. So that's something that would have to be worked out with the licensee and the licensor. We are completely independent of that, and I know that those deals are structured in multiple different ways. But in terms of coming to Kickstarter, I would say that if it is a like big brand, right? Again, if we're talking about like Marvel and we're talking about these sort of like bigger teams, bigger companies, you as the licensor coming to Kickstarter, or the licensee coming to Kickstarter, getting ready to crowdfund it, you are going to have to be prepared to answer from the community, why do you need Kickstarter? That is going to be the number one question. And there is pushback sometimes when people come to Kickstarter with these big projects and these big names. But it also is kind of about what it is you're trying to do. I think Critical Role was a really good example of that, where it's like, you know, at the end of the day, they made a ton of money, like $7.5 million or something like that. But it was about making something new for the community that maybe they weren't able to do otherwise, right? And so if it's just, well, we want to continue doing this thing, but we're just trying to get press, there's a little bit of pushback from the community. But if it's, we really believe in this thing that we're trying to make, and we aren't really able to find funds in other spaces, that's totally fine. I think about the Zach Braff movie. I can't remember the name of it, but he came to Kickstarter and funded his movie. And there was a lot of pushback of, but you're Zach Braff, like you have money, like why are you using Kickstarter? And his response was basically like, well, yeah, it's my money, but I want this to be something that is for the greater good of the creative community, right? Which I think is like it's just such a, like, I really respect that. The other thing is, and we hear this a lot too, well, when these big companies and these big names and these big teams come to Kickstarter, like my project doesn't get seen. And the truth is that's actually not true. You want more of the bigger names and the bigger companies. Obviously we don't want that to like flood the platform, and we don't want that to be like the main sort of like revenue or even just like creative space. But when a Zach Braff, when a Critical Role, when Frosthaven comes to the site and brings in all of these eyeballs, what happens is those people who maybe didn't back, and they've never backed a Kickstarter before, so first time backer, they end up backing multiple projects, and so it just kind of continues to build that community.
Yep. Actually, that raises an interesting question that we probably should touch on too. Is what is the Kickstarter business model? So if I come on the platform with a project, do you guys take a percentage, or what is? Yeah.
So we take 5% of what the full amount funded is. So again, if it's 50,000, but you raise 65, we'll take 5% of the 65. There are additional fees that are associated with payments and processing. So if I think American Express, I think takes a fee or something like that. That's not in our control, unfortunately. So we just tell people anticipate 10%, but 5% is specifically going to Kickstarter.
Got it. Okay, here's an interesting question from Kevin Chauncey from Purple is Royal, Montreal-based indie games marketing company. He wants to know how you get featured on the front page with the game.
Oh yes, the most asked question that I get.
I bet you get this one a lot.
Yeah. So the simple answer is we have an editorial team internally at Kickstarter. they're responsible for all of our features. It's not an algorithm like a lot of people think. It's not actually based on how much money you're bringing into the platform, nor is it based on like how many people are backing your project. We don't really care about that. I mean, it's great and it's fine and like it's helpful, but we want to feature projects that are interesting and cool and like exciting looking. We also, like, one of the reasons I try to talk to as many people as I can is my job is to advocate for you as creators to Kickstarter. So like, I want to know your story. I want to know why you're excited to come to Kickstarter. I want to know why like this weird idea that you have should be made and like brought into the world. But to be featured on the front page of Kickstarter, there's a couple things. One, you definitely need to have like a good high quality image. So if it's like a hand drawing that you're like, I don't know, this is kind of what the thing is going to look like no. We want to, you know, like we want to showcase stuff that is like interesting and cool and unique. We also don't like badges. So we don't like badges that say things like now on Kickstarter or funded in 48 hours or anything like that. Like no text, no badges, like just clean, simple images that really show.
Does the traction that I mean, you do when you identify a project that all of a sudden you see like immediate traction, does that influence a decision as to whether you get on the homepage too, or?
No. Again, it's not based on.
Not at all. Huh?
Yeah, no, it's not really based on metrics. That's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just sort of sight and if someone on our outreach team is in contact with the creator.
Yeah. Okay. Let's put up the poll result because we just have a few minutes left here. So here we go. Okay. So we asked a few interesting questions here of the community. Have you ever provided funding to a project through a crowdfunding platform? Wow. 67% of the people responded said they have. Is that a surprising result, or what do you think, Anya?
I think that seems about right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a creator community industry business crew. So, have you ever raised funding through a funding platform? 22% have, 78% have. That that's not surprising to me.
Yeah, that checks out.
Right. Okay, as a funder, which model most interests you? And this is where I provided, we provided 4 models, and understandably, not all these are match up with the way you guys do it. But the top one is of interest is the Kickstarter model, the reward, where there's no equity taken, and 57% of interested in that model versus 30% who might like an equity-based model.
That checks out. That makes sense to me.
Down to question, the same question, but from the perspective of the project creator as opposed to, and again, the rewards-based model, maybe not unsurprisingly, is the most interesting with equity-based at 22%. The last question is, which platform are you most familiar with for funding creative projects? Ding, ding, ding. Kickstarter at 70%. Just killing it here.
Yep. It's wild.
Yeah. And we also had Patreon, GoFundMe, Indiegogo, and none of the above on the list, but no one exceeded 10% of the rest of the group. I think it's interesting. I mean, I've heard, Kickstarter and kind of the whole kind of creative crowdfunding movement described or compared to kind of, what went on and during the Renaissance, with families like the Medici family funding, artists in Florence and other parts of Europe. Does that kind of, that idea of kind of being a patron of the arts kind of, fuel you and others at the company?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really interesting. The staff at Kickstarter are like definitely some of the most creative people that I've ever worked with. Everyone at Kickstarter has something that they do on the side that is a creative work. So for me, that's music, playing saxophone all over New York City. For Luke, it's, he makes games. That's what he does. Our CEO is an artist. He draws a lot of squids. That's kind of his thing. He was a creative director at Kickstarter before he became the CEO. We have people that are dancers. We have people that are actors. We have people that are directors. We have people that, you know, are really into fashion. Like everybody at Kickstarter has some sort of thing that makes them excited to come to work every single day to kind of help the general creative community. Us on the outreach team, it's exciting for us to see like our sort of like job of choice, our career of choice, to constantly be able to be a part of it, right? Like while I've never made a game, I consume the content that I help make, right? Like I play a ton of video games. I was just playing a video game before this call. And it's something that I love doing. And now having this job at Kickstarter, I love to play tabletop games. And it's provided me this really unique space where I can look at a game and be able to say, oh, my friend made that. Or walking into a board game cafe or a store and just looking around and being like, all my friends made all of these games. This is so cool. It's like it's just a really interesting like space to be in. But the other side of that too is seeing what the Kickstarter creative community has put out into the world at large, which I think people don't actually realize how much content out there is actually because of Kickstarter. During the Oscars, the short that won I can never remember the name of it. It's either Hair Love or Hair Story. That was a Kickstarter project. Again, Critical Role, Kickstarter project. The protest signs that were happening with the women that were in sort of the blue backgrounds, those were all funded through Kickstarter. It's just, it's really kind of like rewarding to constantly see your work kind of put out into the world and know that like you're a small part of this creative community. And as much as like, you know, just the world of the arts is constantly under attack, being able to kind of push back against that and say like, well, actually, here's all of the cool things that I get to be a part of.
Well, listen, it's real.
Hair Love. Thank you. Someone put the name down there.
There it is. All right. Well, that's the final word. It's really been a pleasure having you on the show. Love chatting with you. And,
yeah, you too. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Stay safe, healthy. And folks, tomorrow our show is it's the Rights Tech Roundtable. We have Tobias Casier, co-founder and CEO of Synalytics. Sorry if I slaughtered your last name, Tobias. He'll be on with Paul Sweeting, who is founder and principal of Concurrent Media. So join us back at noon tomorrow. See you, everybody. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you.